Okay, in the past modules, we've learned how if you're a prokaryotic organism, you have pretty simple life cycle, pretty simple reproduction. It's all asexual reproduction and cloning or mitosis. That's how you reproduce. Whereas if you're a eukaryote, you can do this thing called meiosis and fertilization and gametes and zygotes. The life cycle can become much more complicated. When we get to plants, you're going to just hate me. I can live with myself at night. You can hate me all you want. I don't care. So let's see now the feeding side. Does the kind of cell you have determine how you're going to feed? And the answer is yep. But here it's going to be quite different. So let's kind of step back and talk about what it means to feed. And here we're going to get a little bit more technical. When it comes to feeding, we want to get more specific than just eating things. Really, feeding is a way in which you are taking organic molecules and converting them to energy. And how that happens can be very complicated, but at the end of the day, there's two steps that are critical. One step is you produce energy, and the molecule that all of life uses to produce and store its energy is this cool molecule called ATP. And for this class, ATP is fine. Its technical name is adenosine triphosphate. You'll learn about that in other biology classes if you take them. But it's a molecule that stores energy in the bonds of the phosphorus. Okay, um, and all of life is alive has to basically store and convert and use energy. The other thing is, as far as we know, all life in the universe is made up of carbon. We are a carbon-based life form, which means that two things. One, you have to build your body out of molecules built of carbon, okay? And you're going to throw other things in like hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, manganese, potassium, all kinds of other stuff. Um, but at the base you have carbon. And it's the reason for this that we break up chemistry somewhat artificially into general chemistry or physical chemistry or inorganic chemistry and organic chemistry. And organic chemistry is basically the chemistry of carbon and everything else is inorganic, okay? Although carbon shows up in all of them. Now, when we look at metabolism, biochemistry. We're really talking biochemistry, the chemistry of life. We're talking about biochemistry or organic chemistry. What we find is that all of life basically can store energy in one of three ways. Sorry, not how they store it, how they acquire that energy. And so one way is to basically take light and use the radiation, which is a form of energy from light itself, usually from the sun, um, and store that solar radiation in ATP. Okay, so basically convert radiant energy, radiation, into ATP. Um, and can you think of an organism that gets its ATP that way? I know you could, yes, plants. So things that do photosynthesis are getting their ATP kind of indirectly through light. They're getting the energy from the sunlight and like a solar panel converting it to energy. In fact, that's what plants are. They're kind of feeding as solar panels. There's two other ways we can get our energy. One is we can take an organic molecule, something that already has carbon in it, but we're going to talk about carbon separately. An organic molecule, usually a sugar, but there's a lot of different kinds of sugars. And basically you take that food, you break it down into simpler sugars, and then at some point that sugars gets its bonds broken, and the energy gets captured when the bond breaks and gets stored into ATP. Can you think of an organism that gets their ATP, their energy, from sugars and other organic molecules? Yep, you and animals. Okay, and we call that respiration. Respiration gets its energy that way. There are organisms that can also do this with inorganic molecules. That doesn't mean they don't have carbon. Many of these do, but weirdly, methane and carbon dioxide, sometimes also carbon monoxide, although there's carbon, are part of organic chemistry, but are not considered organic. It's a weird little rule. You'll learn those weird exceptions. But you can actually take methane or carbon dioxide or hydrogen sulfide or sometimes weird metals and break the bonds and in the process produce energy. And this sounds weird, but this is what we do when we do nuclear fusion, basically, is we're breaking bonds in a complicated way. It's not really a bond, but it's a part of a like a uranium atom and kind of getting energy stored within the chemistry of those inorganic molecules. Um, it comes out that if you're a eukaryote, you've only got these first two options as ways to get energy. If you're a prokaryote, all three of these become an option. Doesn't mean any eukaryote can do both. Again, you have to be a plant or photosynthetic to do the first one. As an animal, you only have the second option. Same thing with bacteria. Some bacterial cells only do the third, some only do the second, some do the first. But collectively, if you're a prokaryote, all three of these are options. If you're a eukaryote, only the first two. So when it came to reproduction, well, eukaryotes are complicated. When it comes to feeding, at least in this first step, prokaryotes are more diverse, more complicated. Now let's talk about carbon. There's two ways we can get carbon. We can get our carbon from another from CO2. Some organic carbon molecule could be methane, but usually it's CO2. And we call this autotrophic. Or we can get our carbon from another organism that either is alive and we're going to kill it in the process or steal it while they're alive, like a parasite would, or we wait for them to die, which could be a decomposer and takes it from something that's dead. The name for that is heterotrophic. And troph kind of means feeding. You can think of it that way. And so it's self-feeding. You're not eating yourself. It's not like a plant is eating itself, but it doesn't need any other organisms in order to get its carbon. And heterotrophs need other organisms. And here's one of those fun things as a biologist. If you're vegan and you don't eat plants, well, if you're an animal, like a human is, you're still heterotrophic. Humans and other animals can't do autotrophy. We have to do heterotrophy, which mean at some point we're eating other organisms. And I often like to have these fun arguments when we go out to eat, which we haven't done forever. Like since March of 2020, I haven't been in a restaurant. We've gotten takeout once. We're good cooks, but at some point we really do like to eat out. But whether because we're an animal, we're heterotrophs. And what that means is we need other organisms in order to get carbon to stay alive. If you're a vegetarian, if you're a meat eater, you're getting it from plants and animals. If you're a vegetarian, you're still eating other living organisms. I used this example before that if you have lettuce or most vegetables in your refrigerator, they're still alive. Whereas in my case, I know where my food comes from. I know where my meat comes from. We have a butcher, a couple butchers. We have a chicken person that we get our chickens from. We get someone else from our beef. And I know that they're raised humanely. I know that they're slaughtered in a uh, kind of in a ethical way where they don't have to suffer, and it's ethical. And so in my case, when we're eating meat, we know that the animal isn't suffering. And has lived a good life. And when we eat our plants that we get at the grocery store, if we don't get it from the farmer, we actually don't know whether the vegetables were mistreated in their lifetime, whether they were yelled at all the time or abused. And when they're in a refrigerator, they're still alive, almost like being tortured in the refrigerator in this place where they can't thrive, but they're still alive. It's really interesting when you think about biology kind of from a biologist perspective. So ethically, if you're a vegetarian, vegan, awesome. In fact, environmentally, it's fantastic. It's really what we ought to be doing if you care about the future. But just be aware if you're an animal, to stay alive, you have to kill other organisms. Hopefully you do it in an ethical way. If you're autotrophic, you can get by without any other organism. That's not entirely true, but it's basically true. You don't need to kill other organisms or find dead organisms in order to get the carbon. When it comes to prokaryotes, they can do both of these. Again, there are prokaryotes that are autotrophic, there are heterotrophic prokaryotes. Same thing with eukaryotes. When you look at these together, there are 6 combinations. Light and autotrophy. Can you think of an organism that gets its carbon from CO2 and gets its energy from the sun? Yep, that's photosynthesis. That's what plants do. That combination is called photosynthesis. The combination that we do as animals, get it from sugars with heterotrophy, is called respiration. Okay, so these become combinations that are called metabolisms. And those are 2 options, and those are the 2 most common. But you can also still do a combination of light and heterotrophy. Think about that. You need the sun for energy, but you kill other organisms for carbon. There's no eukaryote that does that, but some bacteria do that. You can do, I'm going to get other organisms for their energy, but I'm going to be autotrophic. No eukaryotes do that, but there are some weird bacteria that can do that. They basically get CO2 from the environment for their carbon, but they kill organisms for the energy. It's weird, but it is a combination that some prokaryotes can do. You can do the version of organic and heterotrophy. That's very, very common, respiration. And then if you're bacteria, you also have these combinations. I'm going to eat carbon dioxide both for energy and carbon. That's super efficient. It doesn't produce a lot of energy, but some bacteria can do that. Or I can take in organic molecules for the energy, but eat organisms for their carbon. So collectively, if you're a prokaryote, they can do, and this is a typo, it should say bacteria. Um, the bacteria, the prokaryotes there's some prokaryotes that can do any one of those six combinations. If you're a eukaryote, you only have two options. You're either photosynthetic or respiration. And if you're photosynthetic, you usually also do respiration. Okay. But if you're a eukaryote, when it comes to feeding, it's very, very simple at the metabolic biochemical level. If you're a prokaryote, chemically way more diverse. A good way to think of this is eukaryotes are complicated when it comes to sex, but simple when it comes to metabolism. Prokaryotes are incredibly complicated when it comes to their chemistry, but when it comes to reproduction, super, super, super simple. And we're going to get to bacteria in a little bit in future modules, but for now, if you're a bacterium that is heterotrophic, that is eating organisms, you don't have a mouth, you don't have a stomach because they're single-celled. Typically what they're doing is they absorb the nutrients across their cell membrane and basically absorb it from their surroundings. Sometimes they can release chemicals to kill their neighbors, and then they can absorb their nutrients. This is also true if you're a single-celled protist as well. You're absorbing your nutrients from the world around you. Sometimes you can kill your neighbors and then absorb their nutrients, but again, you're not eating them directly usually. Again, there's exceptions, but if you're bacteria, you're not. Some protists can actually surround their cells and absorb them as an entire organism. But if you're bacteria, you're only absorbing nutrients across your membrane. Okay, so you're still eating other organisms, but you're really more like absorbing nutrients in the world around you. Okay, so let's summarize these in chemical pathways. And again, in later classes, you'll get more chemically sophisticated, but for now, just understand the concepts. And I don't typically care if you do this as a chemical formula or put it in words, but we've got carbon dioxide plus water in the presence of sunlight produces sugar and oxygen. This is photosynthesis. I always draw my sun with a smiley face because the alternative, an unhappy sun, is terrifying to me. So I always make the sun happy because like, that's the way I want it in my world. The opposite of this, if you reverse the arrow, get rid of the sunlight, is basically aerobic respiration. I'm going to explain what aerobic means, but it means you're using oxygen plus the sugar that comes from other organisms that you've eaten or found already dead. And then you're going to break these down into carbon dioxide plus water and then store the energy in ATP. So we're going to put ATP here as well. If you're a plant, you do this and then eat your own sugars to produce your own energy. Okay, so it's not that plants only do photosynthesis. They do both. They have chloroplasts that do this. They have mitochondria that do this. And this is an important thing to know, is that if you're a eukaryote, these things are occurring in organelles. Photosynthesis in chloroplasts, respiration in mitochondria. If you don't have organelles, you're a prokaryote, you can still do this process, but it's not in a chloroplast. It's happening in the cell itself. You can still do aerobic respiration, but it's not in a mitochondria. Then there is another version of respiration. It's basically the same thing, sugar producing carbon dioxide, but it can play out differently. And here it doesn't technically even need oxygen, but I'm going to pretend it's here just to make it parallel. I'm going to do an arrow down, low oxygen, high oxygen. Aerobic means high oxygen. Anaerobic means without oxygen or low oxygen. Here, you don't burn the sugar fully, and you produce less ATP or energy in the process. But here there's two versions. There's one that produces alcohol, ethanol, one that produces lactic acid, and typically we call this process fermentation, and typically we call it alcohol fermentation if you're producing alcohol, which is what a lot of yeast does, or lactic acid fermentation if you're producing lactic acid, which a lot of bacteria does. If you work out and your muscles get sore the next day, it's the buildup of lactic acid because your body's shifted from aerobic to anaerobic because you didn't have enough oxygen absorbed by your body. And then there's another one we'll talk about later on called nitrogen fixation. This is kind of an example of kind of the inorganic version that only bacteria can do. We take inorganic nitrogen, convert it to some version of organic nitrogen, ammonium nitrite, nitrate. You don't need the details.